Good evening, everyone. So great to see you here tonight. I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and it's my honor to welcome you to tonight's program presented in conjunction with our current special exhibition, Courage and Compassion, the Japanese-American World War II experience that was created by the Go for Broke National Education Center. Hopefully you had a little time to visit the exhibit before tonight's talk, but if you didn't, I hope you'll come back and go through it. It's a wonderful exhibit. I'd like to start by thanking our co-presenter for this program tonight, Southern Methodist University Center for Presidential History. It's an honor to work with community organizations like the Center on important programs like tonight's. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our wonderful sponsors for the Courage and Compassion exhibition, which is supported by Texas Instruments, Carl B. and Florence E. King Foundation, Texas Genocide, Holocaust, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission, and our exhibition sponsors, the Orchid Giving Circle and Toyota. And lastly, I'd like to thank our community partners for the exhibition: Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Lone Star, Dallas Jewish Historical Society, Legacy Senior Communities, Southwest Jewish Congress, and Temple Shalom. Please join me in thanking our sponsors for this program. Thank you. And as always, I like to say a special thank you to our board members who are here, to our amazing members and volunteers. The museum couldn't operate without any of you, and I'm very grateful for your support. If you are not a member or a volunteer and you'd like to get engaged, please visit our website. It's the initials of the museum, dhhrm.org, and check out becoming a member or volunteer. We'd love to get you engaged. So before we get started with the program, I wanted to let you know that we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. Those of you in the audience will have note cards that you can write your answer on, and so when we get to that section, just raise your note card and a staff member will come by and pick them up. And if you're joining us virtually, please type your question in the Q&A bar in the chat line, well, you know what I mean. So please type out your question and we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Brian Franklin, Associate Director of SMU's Center for Presidential History, on stage to introduce tonight's speaker. Brian?
Thank you all for joining us this evening. It is a real pleasure. I'm Brian Franklin. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Presidential History at SMU. We are a center that's dedicated to researching and advancing understanding of the American presidency and American history. We aim to do this in three ways: supporting research, especially through our postdoctoral fellowship program, which brings in scholars from all over the country that do research on American history and the American presidency; through a filmed oral history program called the Collective Memory Project, where we film long-form interviews with people who served during the years of the George W. Bush presidency, both in the administration but also outside of; and third, through public engagement, through teacher workshops, through our podcast, The Past, the Promise, the Presidency. Episode 3 drops tomorrow. And through public programs just like this one. And we are so thankful. I'm just personally thrilled to partner with our new friends here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. I've really enjoyed already everyone that I've interacted with: Mary Pat, Sarah Abosh-Jacobson, Annie Black, Caroline Fangman, and I'm sure many more people behind the scenes who I didn't directly correspond with. I get the privilege of introducing our guest tonight, Dr. Stephanie Hinnershitz. Dr. Hinnershitz is a historian of the World War II era home front, with a special interest in civil-military relations, race, and the topic of tonight's event, Japanese-American incarceration. She earned her PhD from the University of Maryland and has served as a professor at multiple universities around the country before coming to her present job, which is historian with the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where she writes, teaches, organizes public programming, does a little bit of everything there at one of the premier museums in our nation. She's an incredibly prolific and award-winning author and writer, having published, this is not a typo, 3 books in the last 7 years, on mostly on Asian American history and the World War II era home front, including a book called A Different Shade of Justice, Asian American Civil Rights in the South, and the topic for tonight, Japanese American Incarceration, the Camps and Coerced Labor during World War II. I told her earlier today that she got a strange welcome to North Texas as we were walking to a coffee shop and the wind almost blew us over. And then when we came out of the coffee shop 20 minutes later, it almost blew us over somehow in the opposite direction. I'm from West Texas, and this was still very much a surprise to me. So I hope that perhaps we can give her a slightly less aggressive, but all the more welcoming intro here. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hinnershitz.
Hello, everyone. So thank you for coming here tonight, and thank you for everyone that Brian and Mary Pat had mentioned for bringing me here. I'm really excited to be here, and especially in conjunction with the new exhibit that's opening. So I want to start a little bit about how I came to this topic. Now, I don't know if any of you are like me, but I grew up in Pennsylvania. That's where I'm from originally. And all throughout high school, I had not learned anything about this topic of Japanese American incarceration, what happened to the Japanese American community during World War II. We didn't cover it. There was a little paragraph in the textbook that we used, and that was about it. So I knew that it had existed and that it happened, but that is all that I was aware of. I went to college and still didn't really cover the topic that much. Still sort of the same treatment, a few paragraphs in a textbook, but nothing really in depth. So I came out of college knowing this wasn't a good thing, this was bad, but not really fully understanding the whole experience of what these predominantly American citizens had gone through, what their lives were like when they were removed from their homes and placed in the camps. I knew nothing about it. Then I went to grad school, and like Brian had mentioned, my area of specialties was Asian American history. And even within my Asian American history class, we did not spend a significant amount of time talking about Japanese American incarceration. So I came to this topic, and really I came to being a World War II historian while writing my second book that Brian had mentioned about Asian Americans in the South. So when I was doing my research, I came across some records at Arkansas about the 2 incarceration camps that were located there in the Delta region of Arkansas, so Jerome and Rower camps. And I was really interested about this because I really wasn't, I had no idea that there were 2 of these camps in Arkansas. And I started to do more research, and I wanted to do something on this topic, but I wasn't sure what. So I really just started to take some research trips and start to read more into the topic, books, articles that had been written, and I got some funding to go to the FDR library in New York. Sort of wanted to get right into it. The guy who signed the executive order, what might I find in his records? What different materials could I be able to use? And it just so happened that I went there in 2017. And when I was there was a special exhibit that was images of Japanese American incarceration. I actually forget the exact title of the exhibit, but it featured portraits and images from different photographers, Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lange, who was there. They showcased different images of what life was like for the Japanese Americans who were held in the camps. And as I walked through the gallery, I noticed something really interesting. And that was that most of the images that were displayed were images of Japanese Americans doing some kind of work. So they were farming, or they were working, just doing kind of general tasks around the camps, cooking, fixing things, doing custodial work, manufacturing, so producing goods, even some for the military, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And then also sewing for young Japanese American women, secretarial work. This was overwhelmingly, the majority of the photos that were there were depicting Japanese Americans doing some kind of work. And in fact, some of these close-up portraits would feature Japanese Americans and would have their name first and then their occupation second, so what it was that they did in the camps. And I left the FDR library feeling a little bit silly about why had I not thought about the type of work that Japanese Americans had performed while they were in the camps. It was just something that I never really considered, and I really never considered why it was that I didn't think about that. I'm sure we have all seen images, the landscape, the buildings, the structures, but I had just not given a moment to think about what was it that Japanese Americans did while they were in the camps. And of course, they were expected by the administration to work, to do some kind of labor, whether that was for self-sufficiency in the camps or proving their Americanism and their loyalty. But labor really, it wasn't an option to not do it. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So I came away with this question of what did it mean for a Japanese American to do work like these images show you, like many Americans did. So during World War II, many Americans farmed. Many Americans worked in manufacturing plants. Many Americans did all kinds of different types of labor. But what did it mean at this particular time for Japanese Americans, over 110,000 of them, removed from their homes along the West Coast in 1942 by the military, and then placed in one of 10 camps that were overseen by the War Relocation Authority? What does work look like when it's behind barbed wire in this specific instance? And so I became really interested in that. And what I want to share with you tonight is really two things. I want to talk about how central labor was to internment and incarceration. So sometimes a lot of people will say it's something that happened. Well, you take a group of people, you forcibly remove them from their homes, you put them in camps. Of course, they're going to do some kind of labor. So in a lot of cases, it's seen as an afterthought. And that's not really the case. So I definitely want to talk about that. And then the second thing I want to talk about is how do we talk about this type of labor? What do we call it? When you have American citizens who were wrongfully imprisoned because they did not get due process, because they were accused of being subversive and disloyal simply because of their race, what do you call the work that they performed when they were essentially incarcerated? And I want to talk a little bit too about terminology, because this is something very interesting to me. And you're in the Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and if you've walked through it before, you know how important language is and how it's wielded and the kind of power that it can have. So you may have heard Japanese American incarceration called something else, and that's Japanese American internment. And after FDR signed Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, it was referred to as internment or evacuation. A lot of different euphemisms that the government had used to kind of downplay just how drastic and disruptive this whole process was. So again, if you've heard it described as Japanese American internment, that's not really accurate. And about 10 years ago, probably over 10 years ago by now, the Japanese American Citizens League got together with some specialists, educators, lawyers, all different kinds of people, and they decided to issue a power of words resolution. And so this is coming from one of the largest organizations that represents Japanese Americans in the country. And they wanted to put out this idea that what you call this time period, what you call what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, it matters. And internment, again, isn't really correct, because if you think about internment and you think about the definition of internment, it has a very specific meaning. So if you would look up internment in a dictionary, you might see something along the lines of being imprisoned during time of war or being detained during time of war. In an American sense, before World War II, we had typically used that, think about World War I, to detain Germans during World War I, other enemy aliens, so people who we are at war with. When it comes to this period and this group of individuals, Japanese Americans, internment doesn't really apply because the vast majority of them were American citizens. So they're not enemy aliens because they were born in the United States. They are citizens. So internment doesn't really fit. And also internment was a process that was really overseen specifically by the Department of Justice. And there, that specifically applied to Germans and Italians predominantly, who were foreign born. So not German Americans and not Italian Americans born here in the United States, but specifically enemy aliens. When it came to Japanese Americans, we're talking about something different, especially, again, because over like 80% of them were born here. They were American citizens who had their rights violated. They did not get due process or a fair trial. The United States government even tried really hard to not use the word citizen whenever it mentioned Japanese Americans who were removed from the West Coast, because that would not go over very well. There was an entirely new agency created, and that's the War Relocation Authority. So that was created specifically to deal with this issue that the United States government is forcibly removing and incarcerating American citizens. So internment isn't really accurate. So I am a historian among many who fully believe that internment doesn't really do this moment justice. It has a very specific term, and it downplays what actually happened. So if you use me, or you hear me use the term incarceration, that's why. I'm following that power of words resolution that comes from the Japanese American Citizens League, and a lot of other historians are using it too. Imprisonment is another word. There's all kinds of different ways to discuss this time period, but internment isn't entirely accurate. So I say all that because, again, going back to this question of what do we call the type of work that Japanese Americans did when they were forcibly placed in these camps. So one of 10 camps, that's the map I have up here. There are also assembly centers that aren't pictured here. Those were basically the centers that Japanese Americans, when they were moved from their homes in May of 1942, they would be held in these kind of temporary detention centers before being assigned to one of the 10 camps up here. So again, if we think about, well, Japanese Americans were incarcerated, they were imprisoned, they performed work. So what kind of work did they do? Was it entirely free labor? Was it forced labor? Well, not every Japanese American was forced to work in the camps. That's something the government tried very hard to avoid. But is it coerced labor? What else are you going to do if you're imprisoned and you need to do something to earn extra money? You need to buy certain things from the camp store that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get unless you work. These things get very tricky. And so that's really the central question that I was interested in. What do we call this? Is it free labor? Is it coerced? Is it prison labor? I have been referring to it as prison labor because these are essentially prisons. And so to me, it makes sense to call it what it is. And that's having American citizens wrongfully accused, placed in camps, and essentially being coerced to work. And I'll get more into that a little bit. So I do want to step back and also keeping this map. Sorry, I never had the map up there. So here's the map with all those camps. Keeping the map in mind, there's a lot of different, if you look, they're all spread out. So they're spread out all over the place. They're not really concentrated in the West Coast. That's because Japanese Americans they were removed from the West Coast. That was considered a military, it's a vulnerable area. So you can't have Japanese Americans being in those areas. That was General John DeWitt. He declared the West Coast a military zone, and from there, all Japanese Americans, whether you're foreign-born or born in the United States, you would be removed and then transferred to one of these camps. So again, if you look at where these camps were, you might be wondering why. So why in some of these areas? Because they are pretty far-flung. The first thing you might notice is that they tend to be in rather rural areas, and that's a fact. So they're placed in these rural areas. And it might make sense, you might think, well, if you have Japanese Americans who are considered by the military, by the government to be potentially subversive, you would want to place them in more rural and less densely populated areas for security purposes. And that's certainly what the government told the American people through different forms of propaganda. So when the government tried to explain to Americans what it was that it was doing, they would say, we're building these camps predominantly because they are areas where they won't be located near certain important defense areas, but also the government would say it's because we're trying to protect Japanese Americans. So it was a very useful argument that the government said, we're doing this for the safety and security of Japanese American citizens because otherwise they might fall victim to racist attacks. So that's the kind of given explanation for this. The other thing is if you go into the archives and you read the records, you'll find that actually at the top of the list, in some cases, in some of the different conversations among the people who created this whole program, labor is at the top of the list. So these camps, in most cases, were selected because they're sites that either needed to have improvements of the area. So things like clearing out land, building irrigation ditches, doing anything that would make the land more arable, make it more inhabitable. Sometimes there would be projects that had been started during the Great Depression that had to be put on hold once we entered into World War II. So the government, with the Department of the Interior, identified an opportunity that these camps could be placed in an area where Japanese American labor could be used to improve the land. Why would they be improving that land? Well, eventually, the idea was whenever the war was over, Japanese Americans would be returned to their homes or removed elsewhere, and then that land would be ready to inhabit by other groups. And this is not something that I get into a lot, but in a lot of these cases, wherever you see these camps, especially out in the West, a lot of the land that was cleared from areas that men who had served could use the GI Bill to build homes. So there's a really strong reason for why these places that look like they're just selected for security purposes, labor. It was labor. There's a lot of different ways that Japanese Americans could be sort of put to use in their work. So clearing out sagebrush, this is from Poston, so the Poston camp in Arizona. Building an irrigation ditch in Arizona, there are two incarceration camps that are really created so that Japanese Americans can come and improve the land for Native Americans. So at Poston, that was actually located on a Native American reservation. And so Japanese Americans built an irrigation system for the reservation that was in place when the camps were eventually dismantled and Japanese Americans left. There was an irrigation system there. So labor, what and how Japanese Americans could be used to finish some of the projects that began before the war, that becomes something that's very crucial, a crucial deciding factor in where camps are located. If there aren't a lot of labor opportunities, there are areas that are still very rural that are struck down. So for example, there was a strong push from the Army to have a camp built in Kansas or Nebraska. So there were two areas. Eventually, the War Relocation Authority said, well, there's really not much that can be done. There's not a lot of land that needs to be improved. We have a greater need for things in other areas. So going back to those camps in Arkansas, they were located in the Mississippi Delta. There still is a lot of reliance on cotton at this time, but during the Great Depression, the cotton crops take a downturn. So there's a lot of emphasis on trying to diversify the crops that could be grown in the Delta. Japanese Americans, in many cases along the West Coast, are incredibly successful farmers. So the governor of Arkansas, who is just a flaming racist at the time, at first says, I don't want any Japanese Americans in my state. When the Army was like, can you please give us this land? It looks like great land, we can do something with it. He says, no, I don't want Japanese Americans in my state. Eventually, what the Army does is tell him, well, we're going to put the camps here whether you like it or not. But you could also use Japanese Americans to help improve the land for the white farmers who live here. Then he says, okay, sounds good. So then the camps are established, and Japanese Americans sort of just till the land. They introduce all kinds of new crops, and they make the land a lot better for farming even when the camps close. So labor, again, really at the center of this. It's not something that just happens. They remove Japanese Americans and put them in camps. It's a deciding factor in where the camps are going to go. So that's really, really significant. Really, from day one, labor is going to be something that's really important. There's also an element, too, of self-sufficiency. So this is a really big theme that runs through a lot of early discussions about what is incarceration going to look like? So sort of the architects of this, the military, the War Relocation Authority, trying to figure out if this is the plan, if the military plan is to remove this group of people and to place them in the camps, then what comes after? What is this whole thing going to look like? Again, this is the United States. So another thing that was in the back of everyone's mind who are planning this is, we need to look like we are not imprisoning people. We're fighting a war against fascism. We can't look like we have concentration camps here. We can't look like we're forcing people to work. We can't look like we've just forcibly removed over 100,000 American citizens, stripped them of their civil rights, and put them in camps. So what is this going to look like? And this is where that idea of self-sufficiency really comes into play. In a very crude way, the architects behind this program see self-sufficiency as a money-saving mechanism. So for Japanese Americans who are imprisoned, if you can use them to make the camps as self-sufficient as possible, that saves money. Less taxpayer money, more money can be put into the defense budget. This is sort of a win-win for the government and the military, not necessarily a win-win for the Japanese Americans who are imprisoned and having to do this work. But self-sufficiency, again, from a very sort of practical matter, that's important. The way it's sold to Japanese Americans is, you're a pioneer. So that's a phrase that is used by the War Relocation Authority to convince Japanese Americans that what they are doing is bringing the really successful farming skills to areas that are very desolate, they're barren, and you're going to make magic out of this. You're a pioneer, just like the pioneers from days past who went west and resettled. That's what you're doing. And so that's the sort of speech that Japanese Americans would hear and would read in the literature that was given to them by the War Relocation Authority when they got to the camps, that you are a pioneer. You have a very specific purpose here. You should be proud. And so this is an image of a Japanese American man farming. This is a Manzanar, I believe. And farming was what most of Japanese Americans did in these camps, grow their own food. They were expected to grow their own food. That food will be used in the cafeterias. It was supposed to be self-sustaining. The War Relocation Authority also put another spin on this. So they saw this as recreating a sense of normalcy. So normalcy pops up all the time in early conversations. We need to make this whole process feel as normal as possible. It's almost like they knew that this was really bad, and they need to convince themselves of how are we going to make this seem okay. And so I do have a quote, because it's a great quote from one of the administrators. We need to help evacuees forget that there was an evacuation through self-sufficiency. Each project is a setting in which normal activities of life can go on as nearly as possible like those of an ordinary American community. So the idea is to make these camps behind barbed wire in very desolate areas seem as normal as possible. But also, again, that pioneering spirit of you can do this on your own, right? You can do this. You can still sort of prove what it is that you're doing, prove that you are capable of sustaining yourself. Even when people in this country are against you, you can do it on your own. So self-sufficiency, this idea, this pioneering spirit. A lot of the work, like I said, it was farming. A lot of agricultural work, food preparation. Other things that were encouraged would be to build stuff, build buildings. So in a lot of cases, Japanese Americans were responsible for actually physically building their own prisons. So building the schools that the children would use, building all kinds of different facilities, hospitals, what have you. They would be responsible for doing that. And this would be sold as, look at you, right here, you can do it on your own. We're going to create a normal community. This is what you did before, even though many Japanese Americans did not have to build their own schools before. They were highly successful farmers. They owned their own property. And now they're coming here and they have to grow food that they haven't grown before. And then this is an image that really kind of speaks to me. So this is from the posting camp in Arizona. And the caption, so this is an official government photograph. And keep in mind, this is a government photograph. This is what they wanted Americans to see. This is like government approved. Just this massive pile of leftover lumber from some of the barracks that were built that Japanese Americans lived in. So the caption under this is something along the lines of, look at all the lumber that Japanese Americans can use to create their own communities. And so it was just this massive pile of stuff. And when Japanese Americans arrived and after they got settled in, assigned to their barracks, it was like, do you want some furniture? There you go. look, use all this lumber and build it yourself, because it's self-sufficiency. It's a pioneering spirit. There's all kinds of ways that the government really tried to sell this to Japanese Americans and to the public. So everything that they told Japanese Americans in the camps, the government was also really telling the American public as well. Another thing was creating goods, especially war material, war goods, things that would be needed by the military. When World War II first breaks out, and when actually the U.S. really starts to get involved in it, we are not sort of that manufacturing powerhouse that we will become. We had to play catch up a little bit. We needed everyone on board, putting everything they had, all of their effort in to make sure that we could be the arsenal of democracy. So another thing that the WRA administrators found that they could use Japanese Americans for is creating war goods. So creating factories, essentially, within the camps. One of the most significant products that was manufactured by Japanese Americans in the camps are camouflage nets. So the massive, massive camouflage netting that was used, especially by the Army Air Force, but in a lot of different ways. That netting was really, really important. But it had to be done largely by hand. This isn't something that could be made in a factory like on an assembly line. Someone had to hand weave all of these nets. And so this is an image from the Manzanar camp, and you can see it's a massive undertaking. So a lot of Japanese Americans could be used to work for private contractors who would contract Japanese American labor from within the camps. So if we're all familiar with defense contracts, this is an example of one during World War II. So a private contractor would set up this factory, hire Japanese Americans who would be put to work. Basically, the WRA and the contractors would kind of split the proceeds, and then some would be given back to Japanese Americans. So a big question, I'll just show you some more images here, and it's Japanese American women who also played a big part in constructing this camouflage netting. So again, these pictures are great because they really kind of put it in perspective. It was dirty work, it was unhealthy, so it took Japanese Americans going on strike at one of these camps before they were given masks to prevent, fibers from going into their lungs, and they would get a lot of sores on their hands from working with the different chemicals that were needed to treat this. Japanese Americans went on strike at one of the detention centers, and then they were able to finally get masks and gloves. But this is a huge, huge undertaking, and if you ever think of Rosie the Riveter, Japanese American women are also doing work, wartime work, but just within the prisons. They're still contributing to the war effort. So the big question about this kind of work is, well, did they get paid? That's usually a question I get asked all the time. If they're being forced to work, well, that means they're not getting paid, right? No, they did get paid. That was something that the government took a lot of pride in, because the government would say, well, you can't be forced to work if you voluntarily sign a contract and you get paid a wage. So did Japanese Americans get paid for the work they did within the camps? Yes. Anywhere from $9 to $12 a month, up to about $18, $19 a month. And so that depended on what kind of skilled labor were you doing. There were secretaries, nurses, doctors, teachers in the camps, just like you would find outside. They were considered more skilled labor, so they would be in the higher end. More manual labor, even though it was really important to keep the camps going, that would be more sort of unskilled labor, so you'd be down at the bottom rung. But that was something that, for the government, for the U.S. government, who's at war with fascism, they knew that there could not be any sort of indication that the work Japanese Americans were doing was forced, that it was not paid, and that there was no contract. Also, the Army did not want any indication that any American citizen was being forced to work without pay, because they were concerned that there would be retaliation against American prisoners of war that were held by the Japanese. So the Army is keeping a lot of different things in its mind about the treatment of Japanese Americans in these camps. So the hallmark for the government of this labor system, the thing that to them kept this free, was there was a contract. No Japanese American was forced to work. They signed a contract, they got paid a wage. That meant this was totally free and uncoerced labor. But that does get a little tricky. And one example that I always turn to is meals were provided. So meals will be provided in the mess halls. So big undertakings, you go, you get your meal, you eat kind of family style, and then you go back to your barracks. There might be a little, you get a little hot plate, you might have some kind of utensils to cook with, but if you wanted anything else to eat, you had to get it from the canteen, which was run by the camp. And how do you think you got stuff from the camp store? You had to buy it. Where are you getting the money from if you're not working? You're not. So if you want extra things, if you have a special diet, a lot of individuals who were held in these camps were elderly. They were not used to eating things like hot dogs. So a lot of Japanese Americans ate a lot of hot dogs in these camps. Especially the teenagers just complained in some of the camp newspapers constantly about how they have to eat hot dogs every single day. And so a lot of older Japanese Americans didn't want to eat that. Starchy food, a lot of bread, things that they really weren't used to. Diabetes was a problem. If they wanted to eat something else, they had to go to the camp store and buy other things. So someone was going to have to work. That's an example of a coerced form of labor. Also, the WRA relied heavily on trying to convince Japanese Americans that in order to prove how American they were, they could work or they should work, because their loyalty was suspect. And if you want to prove to Americans that you are actually 100% loyal, you should go to work. You should prove your loyalty to the nation through the work that you do, even though you're imprisoned, even though you're behind barbed wire. Still, this is an opportunity for you to prove your worth, which isn't a great way of putting things to a group of people who really haven't been proven that they are disloyal, but the WRA really relied pretty heavily on this. And so I have another quote where they just pulled at heartstrings to try and promote Japanese Americans to work for the war effort. Japanese can perform useful work for the nation, given the fullest opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to this nation in their performance of useful work. So lots of that, really laying it on thick. Do you want people to think you're patriotic? You should roll up your sleeves and get to work like everyone else is doing in the country. And so a lot of Japanese Americans, like, yeah, I should, probably. The country is kind of against me right now. And then there are Japanese Americans, and if you haven't gone through the exhibit, you'll read this, many did want to work for the war effort. They wanted to do the best that they could for their country. There's a quote from a young woman in the exhibit that says, even though my country had given up on me, I'm not going to give up on my country. So they really did go full in, and they're going to work for the war effort and support their nation. And so there's another quote from the Manzanar Free Press, which was a camp newspaper that was published by Japanese American incarcerees. This is from May of 1942, really trying to get Japanese Americans to go to work and to work on something like the Camouflage netting project. An opportunity to make tangible contributions to the American war effort and confirm an oath to work as patriotism and loyalty to the United States. It should give lie to those who would impugn on a wholesale basis the loyalty of the great mass of Japanese Americans. So let anyone in this country say that a Japanese American is not loyal. We're going to go to work and prove otherwise. So there was a lot really at stake here that kind of challenges this idea that this is a totally free and uncoerced form of labor. A lot of people will always say to me, well, it's not really, is it really prison labor? They didn't wear uniforms. Could they, they could still buy stuff from the store. They were still getting paid. But again, this is a very weird time right here. Very specific wartime measure. It's very unique, and it's a very American style of a concentration camp. And that was a title from a newspaper and an article in a newspaper that was ran, where this is what a concentration camp looks like in the United States. When the United States is trying to keep up the image of a free and fair and equitable republic, this is the form that takes. And it gets very complicated when we try to discuss, what is this? Is it free? Is it not free labor? There comes a time when the Army has to face this question. And so I'm going to put this image up here. This is also from Manzanar, so it's a guard outside the camp. If you ever forget, or if anyone should forget, like a colleague once said to me, well, where are their uniforms if they're prisoners? Barbed wire and guards, reminding every person who was held in this camp that you are here, and if you try and leave without permission, you will face the consequences for it. So this is an image of what what this looked like. So what the Army faces, as early as spring of 1942, so even before a lot of Japanese Americans would really leave, they were getting just slammed with requests from farmers along the West Coast to not remove Japanese Americans in their areas because they still needed them for labor. So a lot of the same people, a lot of the same white farmers who had for decades been kind of pushing back against, oh, I don't want Japanese American farmers competing with me. They were completely for their removal. Now they're getting worried because, wait, what am I going to do when I can't rely on Japanese American laborers anymore? And I need them to work. I need someone to kind of farm my land. There's a severe agricultural labor shortage in the country at the time. Many, many men are serving overseas. They've left to go work in other wartime industries where they can make more money. So there's a real shortage. And so the Army is just getting slammed with all kinds of requests for this. And this continues even into May and June of 42 when Japanese Americans are removed from the West Coast. Eventually, the pressure gets so big on the Army, who really isn't a fan of this, because they just removed Japanese Americans under the guise of military necessity from the same areas that they're getting pressure on to return them. So the Army is really against this. But eventually, politicians from the West Coast who are Democrats and who are very important political parties of FDR are going to start putting pressure on FDR. You know, I need Japanese Americans to do the labor. They're not doing anything else in the camps, so send them back here and I'll put them to work. Eventually, this pressure builds. FDR will kind of succumb to this pressure. He'll put pressure on the War Department. And basically, the War Department is going to tell the Army, you're going to have to let Japanese Americans go out to help with harvesting crops, especially beets. So beets are a really crucial wartime crop at this time. It's used to make a lot of different war goods. So the sugar is used for rubbing alcohol to make all kinds of industrial products. And there's a real shortage there. So General DeWitt, who's commander of the Western Defense Command at the time, he has to figure out, all right, I'm getting pressure. So how are we going to do this? Because what does it mean to send Japanese Americans who are technically under military control? They're technically detained. Can we release them to go work outside? If we do we have to guard them? If we guard them, doesn't this look pretty terrible to have American citizens being guarded over by men carrying guns? He's in a real, he can't work through this. He doesn't know what to do. He knows he's going to have to do this, but he doesn't exactly know how. So I'm not usually a fan of words on slides, but I did put this up here because this is really, really crucial. There's a lawyer that works for the War Relocation Authority named Maurice Walk. And so DeWitt goes to Maurice Walk and says, what can I do about this? If we release Japanese Americans to go farm, are they freed now? Are they no longer under my control? What do we do? Can we make them come back to the camps after we let them go? Are they now free workers? What Walk devises is this idea of constructive custody. That's what he proposes to DeWitt. And constructive custody uses the idea of a convict labor to apply to this situation. And basically Walk will say, treat or think of a Japanese American who is in one of these camps and under the control and the authority of, in this case, the military and the War Relocation Authority. Think of them as a convict laborer, where you release them, good behavior, you can trust them, but at the end of the day, they come back. They aren't free, they're still under your control. That's the approach to use. And so to me, that really stood out. When I found that in the archives, that is how the Army thought of Japanese Americans who they would release to go work, that was really moving to me. Like, they're taking this concept that's applied to convict laborers and applying it to Japanese Americans. So once DeWitt kind of wraps his mind around this, as early as July of 1942, Japanese Americans are being released to go work primarily in beet harvesting and then later beet planting outside of the camps. They are overseen by local police, so there's not military guards because the Army didn't want that. That would look really bad. but they are under the authority of local police. Employers are supposed to provide room and board for them and not charge them extra or deduct from their pay. They're essentially free laborers, but the minute that they are asked to return to the camps, they return to the camps. They sign a contract, but they only really sign a contract with one individual. And those contracts really are meaningless, because what a lot of young men, like this group, who left to go work in Oregon, so in the Oregon beet industry, they found that they signed a contract to go work with one company, one of these massive sort of beet farmer companies, and the contract didn't really hold because there was this thing called swapping, where different employers could swap out different employees without the permission of the Japanese American employee. So they might think they're going to go work for one corporation, think they're going to someplace, think they're going to Oregon. They get on a train and they find out they're actually going to Colorado. And then they're left in Colorado. And they have no idea where they're supposed to be going or what they're supposed to be doing. They're kind of stranded. And there were bad employers who did charge them room and board to sleep in really terrible conditions. So that's another element of this. Is it free? Is it unfree? Not really sure. It gets a little bit complicated. Now, there also were Japanese Americans, as incarceration continues, who they start to push back against this. And from 1942 to 1943, there is a series of strikes in the camps where Japanese Americans are going to protest both their working and their living conditions, which are often entwined. They're often not separated. So there's a massive wave of strikes from Japanese Americans who are going to demand their working rights, which are also their civil rights. And so this is seen as this mass resistance against what they had been working and operating under. And it scares the War Relocation Authority a lot, because it seems like things are getting kind of out of control. There's a massive uprising strike in Manzanar, the Manzanar camp in Northern California. And what comes out of that is a greater agreement between the War Relocation Authority there and the Japanese Americans for more shared governance. So this idea that workers are workers and they can push back for different workers' rights wasn't always respected, but it is this form of success that Japanese Americans could have by recognizing just how important their work was for what the camps needed, and they could utilize that. So as we get closer to the end of incarceration, when the war is eventually over, by 1944, many Japanese Americans are out of the camps. They're being resettled. If they can find a job and away from the West Coast, they can be released. And so eventually what we're left with is this really complex picture of what this whole time meant for labor while Japanese Americans were incarcerated. So were they free? Were they coerced? It does get complicated because I have an image of a young woman who's a secretary here. For young Japanese American women, in many cases, they had more opportunities while incarcerated because they didn't have to compete with a lot of white women for the same jobs. That's a very complex issue to deal with when we're talking about this type of system. What do you do when Japanese Americans are removed, forced into prisons, and really coerced to work? But in other cases, there might be more opportunities that weren't there. It's messy and it's very complicated, but that's really what this whole story is with Japanese American incarceration. It's a very unique, messy story, but it is part of American history, and it's definitely part of the World War II story. And so that's something that I've really become interested in. How do we incorporate this more into our story, and not just seen as something that happened to one group of people to be forgotten and overlooked? So I'll turn it over for Q&A now.
Okay, our first question. How long did it take after Pearl Harbor for the government to start using Japanese Americans for labor related to the war effort?
It really was a couple months. So May, June, when they first started to be forcibly removed, they had a couple months to try and, if they could find their own place to live outside of those war zones, those military zones, then they wouldn't have to go into a camp. But really by May, June, when they were in the more temporary assembly centers, they were even being used for work there. So it's almost immediately they would be put to work, at least for maintaining the camps and the centers. And then June, July is when they start being used for private farm labor and also manufacturing.
So you talked about this movement that the words matter. And are you seeing a shift in your field more broadly towards using incarceration instead of internment? And is there more work that needs to be done regarding the language?
Yes, so I've definitely seen a huge shift, and even where I work at the World War II Museum, there's been changes. So where it was once internment, it's now incarceration. If you have not visited, or if you do visit, we do have a little exhibit on it, and you will see it referred to as incarceration. That wasn't always the case, but it is now being described as such. Where we have to go and what work we have to do, there is more of a movement now among Asian American historians and other Asian American groups to use the term concentration camp rather than just incarceration. If you go through the exhibit, you'll see it's not a great quote. It's not great in meaning, but it's a really powerful quote from a government official who basically says in 1946, these were concentration camps. You can call them what you want, but that's what they were. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done yet in a lot of fields to think about how do you talk about these things, and is it more appropriate to use the historically contemporary term, or do you start calling it what it is? So that's definitely a direction that I've seen.
Wonderful. Were there any types of labor you came across in your research that were particularly surprising?
Mm-hmm. I would say there were some opportunities for almost growing like the equivalent of victory gardens in the camps. So that was also something, by the way. The government encouraged Japanese Americans to grow victory gardens in the camps to support the war effort. So almost like horticulture, so not farming for self-sufficiency, but farming growing plants to actually make these areas more beautiful. In some cases, Japanese Americans could be paid for that. Not the full higher level salary, but they could be paid for that. And I thought that was really interesting because it was this way of, again, trying to make the camps more hospitable and being paid to do that. That wasn't huge, but that was something that was there. And that was a little bit surprising to me.
How did the pay, you mentioned the pay scale, how did that compare to wages that others would have been earning at the time?
Like outside of the camps?
Outside,
So the best example that I have sort of at my fingertips is to think about those camouflage net workers. So predominantly women who would do it. They got paid, that would have been the upper level, so because they were weavers, so they were considered skilled. That would have been $16, $18 a month. I know that if you look at a woman who was manufacturing, on average outside the camp, well over $100 a month. So it's a pretty big discrepancy. And again, what the government was able to use is say, well, we're giving them
room and board.
Yeah.
Let's see. Were people who were placed in Department of Justice camps, including German Americans and Italian Americans, coerced into labor? And what about the people in regular jails? Were they part of the war effort too?
Yeah, really good question. So there were, I know in California, there was a couple prisons where inmates were forced to work. So they were also put to work making camouflage netting. They were doing a lot of the same jobs that Japanese Americans were doing inside their camps. As far as German and Italian enemy alien detainees, the self-sufficiency element was not there. So they would not be expected to work to make the detention centers go because those were not part of the War Relocation Authority process. That was really, you're a threat, you need to be watched heavily. So it was a little bit of a different process and setting, so that element of you work to sustain the camps was not there. So that level of coerced labor didn't really exist.
And they weren't paid anything for that labor?
No, yep.
Okay. What drew you to studying Asian American studies or history?
Yeah, I got really interested in this topic back in, I'd say probably like my last year of college or so, because I was learning a lot about racial history and racial history of the United States and race relations in general, and I didn't really come across a lot about Asian Americans, or if I did, it was always off to the side. Like it was a separate topic. It wasn't really something that was kind of integrated into the larger history of the United States. So I became really interested in what happens to the story of race when you start to include other groups. And for me, it was really interesting to look at Asian immigration, some of the laws that were very racial, and how that sort of shaped and impacted relationships among different races here. So that's how I got interested in this.
Awesome. What were the interactions between Japanese Americans and Native Americans like? Did they see similarities in their treatment?
Yeah, there is. It's really interesting. There is starting to be a lot more work done on those camps, especially in Arizona, that were on reservations. So there are some stories of especially Japanese American and Native American children at Poston who sort of interacted with each other, and they would try and see if they could see each other and sneak out. It was very difficult because they were kept really sort of separate. But when they first arrived, there are accounts of Japanese Americans at Poston really not being happy with where they were, and they did not want to do what they said. And so this was some of the, and I'm summarizing here, some of the quotes. They're not going to work for free for Native Americans. So there was this really kind of hard line that many Japanese Americans were drawing, that we're not going to be treated like you treat Native Americans on reservations.
Wow.
Which adds another very interesting kind of layer to all this, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great question. Do you see any other historians who've written about the Greatest Generation and the war efforts addressing these particular issues?
Also a very good question. So I work at the National World War II Museum, and it's interesting because I think when people talk about the Greatest Generation, they always include, at least a lot of the books more recently, they turn to the 442nd. As these are individuals who served, went above and beyond, especially when you consider that their families were in camps.
For the audience that doesn't know that history, can you explain
the 442nd? Yes, so this was their profiles of courage are in the exhibit. So this is the all-Nisei Japanese American combat regimental team, most of them from Hawaii, and they were formed out of volunteers. So in 1943, Japanese Americans were allowed to start serving in the military. And so at first, the War Relocation Authority and the War Department wanted to have an all-voluntary unit just because it would look good. It would boost morale. It would help Japanese Americans look good in the eyes of other Americans. So this is also, this is really held up by a lot of people. Tom Brokaw, right? So the guy who wrote the book about the Greatest Generation includes a lot of discussions of the 442nd. But it hasn't really been common to talk about those who were in the camps but didn't serve in a military aspect. So all of the people, the women who did the wartime labor, the Japanese American equivalent of the Rosie the Riveters, that usually hasn't been included when thinking about the Greatest Generation. And I would say for many people, when you think about that image, that doesn't really come to mind, and that's something that needs to be worked on.
Okay. Yeah. So this question goes back to the German and Italian Americans who were detained. Well, no, okay, so German and Italian Americans, not enemy aliens, were there proposals to relocate them? And if not, were there differences in their treatment fundamentally based on racism?
Yes, so there were plans by General DeWitt, who, again, Commander, Western Defense Command. He's the guy who basically signed the military orders to make Executive Order 9066 happen. So a lot of times FDR he's the guy who signed the order, true, but DeWitt is the guy who sort of thought, how is this going to work? And he's the one who ultimately decided to include citizens as well as nationals in this. He was toying around with the idea of doing the same thing for especially Italian Americans on the West Coast. So citizens, not just enemy aliens, but also citizens. That doesn't happen. There are curfews that are placed on Italian enemy aliens, so Italian nationals who live on the West Coast, especially huge population in San Francisco. Those are eventually lifted, and they're lifted around the same time that once and for all, any plans that were thinking about happening to remove or do the same thing for all people of German and Italian descent, no matter if they're citizens or not, were kind of cleared out. So there was some discussion amongst DeWitt's counterpart on the Eastern Defense Command, so that's General Drum. But the logistics were overwhelming because Italian Americans, especially German Americans, if you're talking about like Pennsylvania, those areas, trying to logistically do that, people in the Army and the military recognize that would be nearly impossible, and you would lose so much of the workforce. And there were Democrats, Italian American Democrats in New York, who went to FDR and said, don't think about doing the same thing that you did out there, or you're going to lose a lot of political support. So that there were some plans about it. I would say they weren't as highly developed as what was put into the removal of Japanese Americans. And then race and logistics are also a part of that.
And there probably were no Japanese American politicians at the time.
There were very few local ones, but not any that had like that
Congress
big power. Yeah. Yep.
Last question is a question close to home. Do you have any? Do any of the camps like Crystal City that was right here in Seagoville factor into your work?
Yeah,
Studied that?
I have not done a lot of research into Crystal City or really any of the camps that were specifically designed to hold enemy aliens. That's something that I've not done a lot of research into. I think we also had one in Louisiana near New Orleans as well. These were kind of all over the place. But yeah, I've not done research into that. That's honestly a blind spot. I really just kind of go in on those 120,000 who were moved from the West Coast. So yeah,
But there were some Japanese Americans in those Texas camps.
Yes, there were.
Right.
There were, and also Japanese from South America. So they also ended up in a lot of the detention centers up here, and especially in Crystal City. Some, like policies between the FBI and the governments of like Chile or Argentina, lots of similar processes that happen with Japanese Americans here happen with Japanese there as well. And so they do end up in our detention centers because of sort of politicking between both countries.
Wow. Well, thank you, Steph,
Thank you.
so much. It's a wonderful talk. I think we've all learned so much. Thank you all for being here. I apologize if we didn't get to your question. I think Stephanie will stick around for a little bit. If you have a burning question that we didn't get to answer, please feel free to come up and visit with her. But thank you all. Have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.